You know how when you move to a new place, everything feels exciting at first? That fresh start, the new surroundings, and the hope that maybe this time, things will be different. That's exactly how I felt when I moved to the small town of Maplewood after a tough breakup. I needed a change, a clean slate. So I packed up my life and drove 2 hours away, eager to leave the past behind. The apartment I found was cozy and quaint, nestled in a quiet neighborhood. I loved how close it was to the park, coffee shops, and the little library down the street. I could already picture my routine. Early morning jogs, lazy afternoons with a good book, and nights spent exploring the town. It felt like the perfect escape, or so I thought. But as the days passed, that excitement started to fade. It began with small things, little noises that echoed through the empty apartment late at night. I'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the hallway, but every time I'd peek out, there'd be no one there. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the building settling or my mind playing tricks. I was still adjusting after all, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. Then there was my neighbor, the one who lived across the hall. At first he seemed friendly enough, always quick with a smile and a wave, but he had this way of lingering just a bit too long in conversations, asking questions that felt too personal for someone I barely knew. I found his curiosity unsettling, but I brushed it off as small-town friendliness. I figured I'd just keep my distance and avoid any unnecessary interactions. One evening after a long day at work, I returned home and noticed something strange. My apartment door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, half expecting to find someone inside, but everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, convincing myself I had just forgotten to close it properly. The following night, though, things took a turn. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint tapping noise coming from the living room. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch, brushing against the window. But as the minutes went by, the tapping grew louder and more rhythmic. It felt deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I considered calling someone. Anyone. But my throat felt tight. What if it was nothing? What if I was just being paranoid? Summoning what little courage I had left, I tiptoed toward the sound, my pulse racing with every step. The tapping seemed to echo in the silence of the night, growing louder as I got closer to the living room. I hesitated at the doorway, peering around the corner, half expecting to see someone standing there. But all I found was the empty room bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight outside. Just when I thought I could breathe again, my phone buzzed loudly on the table, making me jump. It was a message from an unknown number. My heart sank as I opened it. The message read, "I see you." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Was it a prank? A mistake? I immediately felt foolish for letting my imagination run wild, but I couldn't shake the cold grip of fear wrapping around my chest. I quickly replied, asking who it was, but there was no response. I told myself it was probably nothing, that I was just overreacting, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. I avoided the living room, kept my curtains drawn, and even started sleeping with my phone close by. Every little sound felt magnified, the rustling of leaves outside, turning into whispers and footsteps. I kept waiting for another message, for someone to reveal themselves, but nothing came. Just silence, punctuated by that eerie tapping noise that seemed to haunt me. Then, one evening, I was awoken by a loud crash coming from the living room. My heart was pounding as I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour. I thought about the old stories my grandmother used to tell me about spirits being more active at that time. I tried to shake off the fear. Maybe I'd knocked something over in my sleep, but the sense of dread settled in, heavier than ever. When I finally got the courage to leave my bed, I stepped into the living room, only to find nothing out of place. Just silence. I turned to head back to my room, and that's when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway. Mirror. It was dimly lit, but I could swear I saw that same face again. This time, it was clearer, and I could see tears streaming down her cheeks. The days turned into a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. My mind spiraled further into a cycle of dread, and I found myself obsessing over every little detail in my apartment. I started double-checking the locks on my doors and windows, and I even took to sleeping with a kitchen knife tucked under my pillow, just in case. Each night, the tapping grew more persistent. It was no longer just a faint noise. It felt like a deliberate rhythm, almost as if someone was trying to communicate with me. I began to dread going to sleep, knowing that I'd wake up to the haunting sound that echoed through my mind. Suddenly, I heard something else. A faint voice. It was barely a whisper, but I could swear it was calling my name. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. Had I really heard that, or was it just another trick of my imagination? I glanced at my phone, desperate for some distraction. As I scrolled through social media, my heart sank when I noticed a notification. Another message from the unknown number. This time it read, "I see you in your window." Panic coursed through me as I glanced towards the window. I could feel the shadows shifting, pressing against the glass as if someone were on the other side, watching me. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady, but the fear felt suffocating. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The next day I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The fresh air was a welcome relief, but even outside I felt the eyes of strangers on me. Every passerby felt like a potential threat, their faces morphing into masks of suspicion. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. As I wandered through the park, trying to escape my racing thoughts, I noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the path. It was my neighbor again. He was sitting on a bench, seemingly engrossed in a book, but something about his presence sent chills down my spine. I considered turning back, but a part of me was drawn to him. Maybe it was the isolation I felt, or perhaps a desperate need to connect with someone. When I approached cautiously, forcing a smile, he seemed genuinely pleased to see me. I tried to keep the conversation light, but I could feel my heart pounding. The air around us felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. I mentioned my unease about the noises and how I'd been feeling, but he brushed it off with a casual wave, saying it was probably just my imagination. As he talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow connected to the messages, to the unsettling presence that felt like it was closing in on me. My mind raced with possibilities, and I could feel the panic rising. I wanted to back away, but I also wanted answers. That night, the tapping noise echoed in my mind, growing louder and more pronounced. I lay in bed, wide awake, the shadows in my room seeming to stretch and loom over me. I was paralyzed by fear, listening intently as the sound echoed through the silence. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash coming from the living room. I shot out of bed and ran to the door, my heart racing. As I swung it open, the tapping noise morphed into something more menacing, a deliberate knock echoing through the hallway. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. In a moment of adrenaline-fueled panic, I stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard a voice outside, murmuring softly. The shadows felt darker, and I could sense the figure moving just outside my door. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but my fingers trembled too much to dial. The knocking stopped, and I was left in a chilling silence. My breath quickened, and I knew I had to confront whatever was outside. With a deep breath, I forced myself to look through the peephole, but I could only see darkness. Suddenly, the door rattled violently. I jumped back, fear gripping me as I realized I couldn't hide any longer. I had to stand my ground. The following morning, I woke up feeling like a storm was brewing inside me. The shadows in my room seemed darker, and the tapping had reached a fever pitch in my mind. I knew I had to take action. I couldn't allow this anxiety to control my life any longer. With determination, I got dressed, my heart racing as I prepared to leave the apartment. I double-checked the locks on my door and grabbed my phone, clutching it tightly. I made my way to the local police station, each step feeling heavier than the last. The thought of confronting my fears was daunting, but I couldn't ignore the mounting pressure any longer. When I entered the station, the fluorescent lights felt harsh, illuminating the faces of officers who were busy with their work. I approached the front desk, my palms sweaty as I explained my situation. I told the officer about the messages, the tapping, and my increasingly uncomfortable interactions with my neighbor. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening as I recounted my experiences. The officer listened patiently, taking notes and asking questions. She assured me that they would investigate the matter and that I had done the right thing by coming forward. As she spoke, I felt a small flicker of relief. Maybe this was the help I needed. But a part of me still worried about what would happen next. Would they take me seriously? Would they actually confront my neighbor? After leaving the station, I felt lighter, but the weight of uncertainty still loomed over me. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself with mundane tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I found myself glancing at my phone every few minutes, waiting for any sign of a new message. That evening, I returned home, feeling a mixture of trepidation and determination. I decided to call a friend, sharing everything that had happened. As I spoke, I felt the fear begin to lift, replaced by a sense of empowerment. I knew I wasn't alone in this, but just as I hung up, my phone buzzed again, and my heart dropped. It was another message from the unknown number. "You think they can protect you?" Panic surged through me as I felt the walls of my apartment closing in once again. I quickly pulled the curtains shut, plunging the room into darkness. The tapping began anew, echoing through my mind, now mingled with the chilling laughter that haunted me. Just then, I heard a loud knock at my door. My heart raced as I moved closer, peering through the peephole. I could see my neighbor standing there, a smirk on his face. The shadows danced around him, and for a brief moment, I felt paralyzed by fear. He was back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew I had gone to the police. Gathering every ounce of courage, I opened the door a crack, just enough to speak without letting him in. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed some space. The look on his face shifted slightly, but he maintained that eerie smile. "You're always welcome to talk. I just want to make sure you're okay," he said, but his words dripped with an unsettling tone that sent chills down my spine. As he stood there, I felt the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I closed the door firmly, locking it as soon as it clicked shut. The tapping grew louder, almost desperate now, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I decided to call the police again, explaining that my neighbor had shown up at my door and that I was genuinely afraid. The officer assured me they would send someone over right away, but the wait felt agonizing. As I paced my apartment, the noise from the outside world faded into the background. My breathing quickened, and I kept glancing at the clock. Minutes felt like hours. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I heard the familiar sound of sirens outside. Relief washed over me, but fear lingered. When the officers knocked on my door, I opened it cautiously. They were calm and professional, asking for details about my situation. I recounted everything: the tapping, the messages, and the unnerving interactions with my neighbor. They nodded, taking notes and assuring me that they would look into it. The officer who had initially taken my report stepped forward, reassuring me that they would take my concerns seriously. She asked if I could identify the neighbor and pointed toward the door. I hesitated, glancing back at the hallway. What if he was listening? With a deep breath, I nodded. The officer asked me to wait inside as they approached my neighbor's apartment. I stood by the door, heart racing, waiting for a sign that everything would be okay. A few minutes later, I heard the officers' voices echoing down the hall, followed by my neighbors, sounding defensive. I couldn't hear the words, but the tension was palpable. I stepped closer to the door, listening intently. Suddenly, the door swung open and the officers stepped inside. One of them informed me that they had spoken with my neighbor, who denied any wrongdoing. However, they warned him to keep his distance and informed him that further reports could lead to legal action. As they left, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was soon replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Would he actually leave me alone? That night, I struggled to find sleep. The tapping had stopped, but the shadows seemed to linger, reminding me of the fear that had taken hold of my life. I knew this experience would leave a mark on me, a lesson in vigilance. Days turned into weeks, and while the tapping ceased, I remained vigilant. I made sure to keep the curtains drawn and the doors locked. I began to establish a routine of safety, reaching out to friends more frequently and becoming involved in the community. I wanted to feel a sense of belonging and control over my life again. Reflecting on those nights filled with fear, I realized that sometimes the biggest dangers lurk in the shadows of our own minds. It was a sobering reminder that vulnerability can breed fear, but resilience can light the way forward. As I finally settled into my new home, I understood that while fear may never fully disappear, I could confront it, no matter how daunting the journey might be.